When United Airlines Flight 847 left Denver International Airport on a routine Tuesday morning, nobody expected that the quiet woman in row 12, seat C, would soon be the only thing standing between 183 passengers and disaster. Abigail Fowler looked like any other business traveler, laptop bag, coffee in hand, unremarkable in every way. But hidden beneath her corporate consultant exterior was a secret that would save every life on that plane when the unthinkable happened at 35,000 feet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The departure gate at Denver International buzzed with typical Tuesday morning energy as passengers lined up for United Flight 847 to Boston. Business travelers checked emails, families corralled restless children, and flight attendants prepared for what should have been a routine 3-hour journey across the heartland of America. In the middle of this ordinary chaos sat Abigail Fowler, 34, clutching a boarding pass for row 12, seat C. To anyone watching, she appeared to be exactly what her business card claimed, a senior logistics consultant for Morrison & Associates, traveling to Boston for a supply chain optimization conference. Her navy blazer was perfectly pressed, her auburn hair pulled back in a professional bun, and her expression carried the weary resignation of someone who spent too many hours in airport terminals. But appearances, as Abigail had learned over the past 8 years, could be devastatingly deceiving. What fellow passengers couldn't see was the faded tan line on her ring finger where a wedding band had once rested, or the careful way she avoided looking directly at men in military uniforms scattered throughout the terminal. They couldn't know that the woman quietly reading a logistics manual had once been Lieutenant Commander Abigail Chun, one of only 12 women to complete the Navy's elite Top Gun program at Naval Air Station Fallon. They certainly couldn't imagine that this unassuming consultant had logged over 2,000 flight hours in FA-18 Super Hornets, mastering carrier landings that veteran pilots described as controlled crashes onto a postage stamp, floating in the middle of an ocean. Or that she'd been personally selected by Admiral Sarah Mitchell to join the Navy's most prestigious fighter weapons school, where only the top 1% of naval aviators earned their wings. Abigail's journey to row 12, seat C, had begun 12 years earlier when she was Abigail Chun, a 22-year-old Naval Academy graduate with perfect vision, lightning reflexes, and an obsessive need to prove that a first-generation Chinese-American woman could excel in any arena she chose. Her parents, Dr. James Chun and Dr. Lisa Chun, had immigrated from Taiwan with medical degrees and the unshakable belief that education was the only path to American success. They'd expected their daughter to follow their footsteps into medicine, or perhaps pursue engineering like her younger brother David. They had not expected her to announce during her sophomore year at Annapolis that she intended to become a fighter pilot. Flying is not a stable career for a woman, her mother had said during a tense family dinner in their Potomac, Maryland home. What about marriage? What about children? What about security? Abigail had listened respectfully, then applied for naval aviation anyway. Flight training at Naval Air Station Pensacola had been a baptism by fire. Of the 47 pilots in her training squadron, only 6 were women. The instructors weren't openly hostile, but they weren't encouraging either. Comments like, "Let's see if she can handle the G-forces," and "hope she doesn't cry during her first hard landing," followed her through ground school and into the cockpit. Abigail's response had been to outperform everyone. She graduated second in her flight training class, earned her wings of gold, and was selected for FA-18 Super Hornet training at Naval Air Station Lemoore. While other pilots celebrated their achievements at the Officers Club, Abigail studied flight manuals and practiced emergency procedures until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. The invitation to Top Gun came during her 3rd deployment. Aboard the USS Ronald Reagan, Admiral Mitchell, herself a trailblazer as one of the Navy's first female carrier air group commanders, had been tracking Abigail's performance across multiple combat exercises. "Shun," Admiral Mitchell had said during a private meeting in her shipboard office, "your performance metrics are exceptional. Your formation flying is textbook perfect, your weapons employment is surgical, and your situational awareness under stress is better than pilots with twice your experience." Abigail had maintained her composure, but internally she'd felt validation that years of extra preparation had finally been recognized. However, Admiral Mitchell continued, "Top Gun isn't about being good. It's about being the absolute best and then teaching others to reach that level. Are you prepared for an environment where being excellent isn't enough?" "Yes, ma'am," Abigail had replied without hesitation. Naval Air Station Fallon, Nevada, home of TOPGUN, existed in a desert landscape that seemed designed to test human limits. The school's motto, "Train hard, fight easy," wasn't just philosophy, it was survival doctrine. For 6 weeks, Abigail flew against the most skilled adversary pilots in the world, engaged in air-to-air combat scenarios that pushed both aircraft and pilot beyond normal operational parameters. Her class consisted of 11 other pilots, all men, all with reputations as exceptional aviators. The competition was fierce, personal, and absolutely relentless. Every flight was graded, every decision analyzed, every mistake magnified under the desert sun. "Chun, you're flying like you're afraid to take up space," Commander Jake Morrison, her lead instructor, had told her after a particularly challenging dogfight exercise. "In the air, hesitation kills. Confidence keeps you alive." The comment had stung because it contained truth. Abigail realized she'd been flying defensively, trying to avoid mistakes rather than aggressively pursuing victory. That night, alone, in her quarters, she'd made a decision that would define the rest of her Top Gun experience. The next morning, she flew like she owned the sky. Her final exercise at Top Gun was a complex scenario involving multiple adversaries, limited fuel, and rules of engagement that changed mid-flight. Abigail's performance was flawless. She successfully defended her assigned target, eliminated 3 adversary aircraft, and landed with just enough fuel to taxi to the flight line. Commander Morrison's debrief was brief. "Shun, that was the finest demonstration of tactical flying I've seen in 15 years of instruction. Welcome to the top 1%. Abigail graduated Top Gun ranked first in her class, earning her a position as a strike fighter tactics instructor and a reputation as one of the Navy's most capable combat pilots. For 3 years, she trained other pilots in advanced tactical flying, sharing knowledge that could mean the difference between mission success and disaster. But her military career ended not in a blaze of glory, but in a moment of devastating personal loss. Captain Michael Fowler had been her squadron mate, her closest friend, and eventually her husband. They'd met during advanced training at Lemoore, bonded over shared experiences as children of immigrants, his family from Ireland, hers from Taiwan, and married in a small ceremony at the Naval Academy Chapel. Michael understood the demands of naval aviation because he lived them too. Their marriage worked because they both accepted the risks, the deployments, and the absolute dedication required to excel in fighter aviation. They'd planned to serve together for 20 years, retire as commanders, and start the family they'd always talked about. The training accident happened on a clear Thursday morning over the Nevada desert. Michael's F-18 experienced a catastrophic engine failure during a routine exercise. The ejection seat malfunctioned. He never had a chance. Abigail had been in the air when it happened, close enough to see the explosion, close enough to call for search and rescue, close enough to watch her future disappear in a column of black smoke rising from the desert floor. Asterisk. The Navy offered counseling, suggested she take leave, recommended she consider instructor positions that would keep her safely on the ground. Instead, Abigail had submitted her resignation letter 3 months after Michael's funeral. "I can't fly anymore," she'd told Admiral Mitchell during her exit interview. "Not because I'm afraid, but because I can't separate the mission from the loss. Every time I strap in, I see his aircraft going down. That hesitation you warned me about? It's back, and it's going to get someone killed." Admiral Mitchell had tried to convince her to reconsider, pointing out that the Navy had invested millions in her training and that she represented the future of naval aviation. But Abigail's decision was final. She'd left the Navy with an honorable discharge, the respect of her peers, and skills that had no obvious civilian application. Morrison and Associates had hired her because of her logistics background and her security clearance, never knowing they'd recruited someone who could fly combat aircraft better than most people could drive cars. For 8 years, Abigail had successfully buried Lieutenant Commander Chun beneath the professional facade of Consultant Fowler. She avoided airports when possible, declined invitations to air shows, and politely changed the subject whenever conversations turned to aviation. Her colleagues knew she'd served in the Navy, but assumed she'd been in supply or administration. The closest she came to flying was the occasional commercial flight for business travel, and even then she chose aisle seats to avoid looking out windows that might trigger memories she'd worked hard to suppress. Now, sitting in row 12, seat C, waiting for United Flight 847 to board, Abigail checked her watch and reviewed her presentation notes for the Boston conference. Tomorrow she would discuss supply chain optimization strategies with executives who thought logistics was boring but necessary. She would speak with authority about efficiency metrics and cost reduction initiatives, playing the role she'd perfected over 8 years of corporate consulting. What she wouldn't discuss was her other expertise, the knowledge that commercial aviation and military aviation shared fundamental principles of aerodynamics, navigation, and emergency procedures. She wouldn't mention that she could read instrument panels better than most commercial pilots, or that her hands still remembered the feel of flight controls under pressure. As boarding began and passengers filed past her seat, Abigail noticed the flight crew with professional interest. Captain Robert Harrison looked experienced, probably former military based on his bearing and the precision of his pre-flight movements. First Officer Jennifer Walsh appeared competent but young, likely with less than 5 years of commercial experience. The flight attendants, Sarah Martinez, David Kim, and Lisa Thompson, moved with the practiced efficiency of crew members who'd worked together before. Good team dynamics, Abigail noted automatically, then caught herself thinking like a military officer and forced her attention back to her conference materials. At 8:47 a.m., United Flight 847 pushed back from the gate at Denver International Airport. As the Boeing 737-800 taxied toward runway 34R, Abigail kept her eyes focused on her laptop screen, avoiding the window view that might remind her of other takeoffs from other runways when she'd been the one in control. The engine spooled up for takeoff, and despite herself, Abigail felt a familiar sensation, the subtle shift in cabin pressure, the change in engine harmonics, the moment when lift overcame gravity and the aircraft transitioned from ground vehicle to flying machine. For just an instant, she allowed herself to remember what it felt like to be airborne by choice rather than necessity, to command rather than simply endure flight. Then she closed her laptop and settled back for what should have been an unremarkable journey to Boston. None of the 183 souls aboard Flight 847 could have predicted that in less than an hour, the unremarkable woman in row 12, seat C, would become their only hope for survival. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Flight 847 had been airborne for 53 minutes when Captain Robert Harrison felt the first flutter of discomfort in his chest. The sensation was subtle, a tightness that he initially attributed to the extra cup of coffee he'd grabbed during his pre-flight routine at Denver International. At 58, Harrison had logged over 20,000 flight hours across military and commercial aviation, and he'd learned to distinguish between normal stress and something more concerning. This felt different. The aircraft was cruising smoothly at 37,000 feet, autopilot engaged, with clear skies stretching endlessly toward the eastern horizon. First Officer Jennifer Walsh was reviewing their approach procedures for Boston Logan, and the cabin behind them hummed with the quiet contentment of passengers settled into their journey. Harrison reached for his water bottle, thinking hydration might ease the sensation, but as he lifted his arm, a sharp pain shot down his left side like lightning through his nervous system. His vision blurred momentarily, and he gripped the armrest of his captain's chair to steady himself. "Bob, you okay?" Walsh asked, noticing his sudden rigidity. Harrison wanted to say yes, to dismiss the concern and continue their routine flight to Boston. But 28 years of military discipline had taught him that admitting weakness early could prevent catastrophic failure later. The pain was intensifying, spreading from his chest down his left arm with an urgency that his medical training recognized immediately. "I'm having chest pains," he said quietly, his voice strained but controlled. "Significant ones." Walsh's training kicked in instantly. As first officer, she'd drilled emergency scenarios countless times, but this was her first real medical emergency. At the controls of a commercial aircraft. How bad? Scale of 1 to 10? Harrison tried to speak but found breathing increasingly difficult. The pain had evolved from discomfort to agony, and he could feel his heart rhythm becoming irregular. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool cabin temperature. 8. Maybe 9, he managed, then leaned forward as another wave of pain crashed over him. Walsh immediately took control of the aircraft, disengaging the autopilot and assuming command responsibilities. Her hands moved across the control panel with practiced efficiency, though internally she was calculating the terrifying mathematics of their situation. They were 400 miles from the nearest suitable airport, flying at maximum altitude with 183 passengers whose lives now depended on her ability to handle an aircraft. She'd been certified to fly only as a supporting officer. "Okay, Bob, I'm taking control. Try to stay calm while I get us some help." She keyed the radio to contact Denver Center. "Denver approach, United 847. We have a medical emergency on board. Request immediate priority handling and vectors to the nearest suitable airport." The response came back immediately. "United 847, Denver approach. Understand medical emergency. Say nature of emergency and souls on board. Denver, United 847. We have 183 souls on board. Captain is experiencing what appears to be cardiac distress. First officer assumes command. Request emergency handling." In the control room at Denver Center, Controller Michael Stevens felt his stomach drop. Medical emergencies were challenging enough, but when they involved flight crew, the complexity multiplied exponentially. He immediately began coordinating with surrounding facilities to clear airspace and identify the best diversion airport. "United 847, Denver. Understand. We're working on options. Can you maintain current altitude and heading?" "Affirmative, Denver. We can maintain current flight parameters." But even as Walsh spoke those words, she knew their situation was deteriorating rapidly. Captain Harrison's condition was worsening. His breathing had become labored, and he was showing signs of losing consciousness. She needed medical assistance immediately, but more critically, she needed help flying an aircraft she'd never been primary pilot in command for during an emergency. Walsh activated the cabin intercom system. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Walsh from the flight deck. We're experiencing a medical emergency that requires us to divert to the nearest airport. Please remain in your seats with seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, Please report to the flight deck immediately." The reaction in the cabin was immediate and varied. Some passengers exchanged worried glances, others reached for their phones despite being at cruising altitude, and a few began to look around nervously as if the aircraft itself might provide answers. In row 12, seat C, Abigail Fowler's head snapped up from her laptop screen. The tone in the first officer's voice triggered something deep in her military training, the controlled calm that masked genuine concern. She'd heard that same tone in combat briefings when situations had shifted from routine to critical. Flight attendant Sarah Martinez reached the cockpit first, followed quickly by David Kim. What they found made their emergency training suddenly feel inadequate. Captain Harrison slumped in his seat, semi-conscious and clearly in severe distress, while First Officer Walsh tried to simultaneously fly the aircraft and coordinate their emergency response. "How can we help?" Martinez asked, though she already knew the answer would be complicated. "I need someone to check if there's a doctor on board," Walsh said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "And I need Captain Harrison moved to the cabin so medical personnel can work on him without interfering with flight operations." What Walsh didn't say, but what she was desperately thinking, was that she needed someone who understood the complexity of flying a commercial aircraft during an emergency. Her training had prepared her for many scenarios, but assuming command during a medical crisis, while attempting an emergency landing, was beyond her experience level. As Martinez and Kim carefully moved Captain Harrison to the first-class cabin, Walsh continued working with air traffic control to identify diversion options. Kansas City was closest, but the weather was deteriorating. St. Louis had better conditions, but would require more fuel than they might have available for a safe approach. Denver Center, United 847. "What's the weather looking like at Kansas City?" United 847. "Kansas City is reporting winds gusting to 35 knots. Visibility 3 miles and light snow. We can vector you there, but conditions are marginal." Walsh felt her confidence wavering. Landing in challenging weather was difficult enough, with an experienced captain providing guidance. Attempting it alone, with passengers' lives depending on her performance, was terrifying. Meanwhile, in the first-class cabin, Dr. Patricia Reeves, a cardiologist from Denver Presbyterian Hospital, was working on Captain Harrison. Her examination confirmed what everyone feared. Harrison was experiencing a massive myocardial infarction, a heart attack severe enough to be immediately life-threatening. "He needs emergency cardiac intervention," Dr. Reeves told Martinez quietly. "We need to get this aircraft on the ground as quickly as possible." Martinez relayed this information to Walsh, who felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like lead. She was 29 years old with 3,200 total flight hours, most of those as first officer. She'd never landed a commercial aircraft in challenging weather conditions without an experienced captain beside her. In the cabin, word was spreading that something serious was happening. Passengers could see medical personnel working on someone in first class, and the aircraft's slight course changes indicated they were no longer following their original flight plan. Row 23, Seat A, contained retired Air Force Colonel James Peterson, who'd spent 30 years flying everything from fighters to transports. He recognized the signs of an aircraft in distress and began considering whether he should identify himself to the crew. Row 8, Seat F, held commercial pilot Lisa Chun, no relation to Abigail, currently between airline positions, who was running similar calculations about whether her experience might be useful in whatever emergency was unfolding. But neither of them had the specific combination of skills that the woman in row 12, Seat C, possessed, skills she'd spent 8 years trying to forget. Abigail closed her laptop and listened carefully to the sounds around her. The engine harmonics were normal, suggesting no mechanical issues. The aircraft's movements indicated controlled flight, not structural problems. But the crew's tone and the medical activity in first class painted a clear picture. They were dealing with pilot incapacitation. As someone who'd trained extensively in emergency procedures, Abigail understood that First Officer Walsh was facing a scenario that even experienced pilots found challenging. Commercial aircraft were designed to be flown by two-person crews for exactly this reason. The workload during emergencies required multiple sets of trained hands and minds. Walsh's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be making an emergency landing in Kansas City due to the medical situation. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened and follow all instructions from the cabin crew." Abigail felt her pulse quicken as suppressed instincts began to surface. She knew Kansas City International Airport. She'd landed there dozens of times during her military career. She knew the approach patterns, the runway configurations, and the challenges that crosswinds could present during landing. More importantly, she knew that a first officer attempting an emergency landing alone in challenging weather was a recipe for disaster, regardless of that officer's training and competence. For 8 years, Abigail had successfully avoided situations that might trigger her pilot instincts. She'd chosen ground transportation when possible, sat in aisle seats to avoid seeing the horizon, and built a life that had nothing to do with aviation. But sitting in row 12, seat C, listening to the barely controlled stress in First Officer Walsh's voice and watching medical personnel fight to save Captain Harrison's life, Abigail realized that her carefully constructed civilian identity was about to collide with a situation that required skills only she possessed. The woman who'd once been Lieutenant Commander Chun, Top Gun graduate and fighter weapons instructor, was about to face a choice that would determine whether 183 people lived or died. Remain invisible in row 12, or step forward and reveal capabilities she'd spent 8 years trying to forget. Outside the aircraft windows, Kansas City approached through a haze of snow and uncertainty. While in the cockpit, First Officer Walsh prepared for the most challenging landing of her career, unaware that help was sitting quietly in the cabin behind her, wrestling with a decision that would change everything. The decision crystallized for Abigail Fowler in row 12, seat C, when she heard First Officer Walsh's voice crack over the intercom during her third attempt to coordinate with Kansas City approach control. The subtle tremor, barely perceptible to most passengers, was unmistakable to someone who'd spent years training pilots under extreme stress. Walsh was losing her composure, and that meant 183 people were running out of time. Abigail unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, her legs surprisingly steady despite the turbulence that had begun as they descended toward Kansas City. Around her, passengers clutched armrests and whispered prayers, but Abigail moved with the purposeful calm of someone who'd made an irreversible decision. She walked forward through the cabin, past worried faces and anxious conversations, until she reached the galley where flight attendant Sarah Martinez was frantically coordinating with the medical team working on Captain Harrison. "Excuse me," Abigail said quietly, her voice cutting through the chaos with military precision. "I need to speak with the first officer immediately." Martinez looked up, stress and exhaustion evident in her expression. "Ma'am, I understand you're concerned, but we need to keep the aisle clear for medical." "I'm a pilot," Abigail interrupted, the words feeling foreign after 8 years of silence. "Military trained. I can help." Martinez stared at her for a moment, processing this unexpected development. In her 12 years as a flight attendant, she'd encountered passengers claiming expertise during emergencies before, usually involving alcohol and overconfidence. But something in Abigail's demeanor, the way she stood and spoke, suggested this was different. "What kind of pilot?" Martinez asked. "Naval aviator, fighter pilot. I can fly this aircraft." Martinez didn't hesitate. She activated her headset and spoke directly to the cockpit. Jennifer, I have a passenger back here who says she's a military pilot and can assist. Walsh's response came immediately, tinged with desperation she was trying to hide. Military pilot? What branch? What aircraft? Martinez looked at Abigail expectantly. Navy, FFA-18 Super Hornets. I'm also certified on multiple transport aircraft. Abigail replied, then added the credential that would mean everything. Top Gun graduate. The silence that followed stretched for several seconds before Walsh's voice returned, this time with something approaching hope. Send her up. As Abigail moved toward the cockpit, she felt 8 years of carefully constructed civilian identity falling away like old clothing. Her posture straightened, her breathing regulated into the controlled rhythm she'd learned during high-stress flight operations, and her mind began automatically running through emergency checklists she hadn't thought about in nearly a decade. The cockpit of United Flight 847 was chaos barely contained by professional training. First Officer Walsh sat in the right seat, surrounded by blinking warning lights, radio chatter from multiple air traffic control centers, and weather radar showing increasingly dangerous conditions ahead. Her hands moved competently across the controls, but Abigail could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her movements that indicated someone operating at the edge of her capabilities. I'm Jennifer Walsh, First Officer, Walsh said without taking her eyes off the instruments. Are you really Top Gun qualified? Lieutenant Commander Abigail Chen, retired. Abigail replied, using her military rank and maiden name instinctively. Graduated Top Gun class of 2018, ranked first. Over 2,000 hours in high-performance aircraft, including carrier operations. Walsh finally looked at her, and Abigail saw a mixture of relief and skepticism. This is a Boeing 737-800, not a fighter jet. The principles are the same, Abigail said, studying the instrument panel with eyes that hadn't lost their ability to rapidly process complex flight data. Aerodynamics, navigation, emergency procedures. I can read these instruments better than most commercial pilots. Outside the aircraft, Kansas City International Airport was struggling with deteriorating weather conditions. Snow was falling harder now, and crosswinds were gusting to nearly 40 knots, right at the limits of safe landing parameters for a Boeing 737. Kansas City approach, United 847. Walsh transmitted. We're showing winds at 38 knots, gusting to 42. Can you confirm runway conditions? United 847, Kansas City. Runway 1 left is currently our best option. Winds are 290 at 35, gusting to 40. Braking action reported as fair. Emergency equipment is standing by. Abigail listened to the exchange while studying the weather radar display. The storm system was intensifying, and the window for a safe landing was closing rapidly. More concerning was Walsh's inexperience. With crosswind landings in a commercial aircraft, something that required precise timing and confidence that comes only from years of practice. Jennifer, Abigail said carefully, not wanting to undermine the first officer's authority, while recognizing the gravity of their situation. Have you performed many crosswind landings as pilot in command? Walsh's hesitation answered the question before her words did. I've done them during training, and several times as first officer with an experienced captain guiding me. But never alone, and never in conditions this challenging. The admission hung in the air between them like a confession. Both women understood what it meant. Walsh was competent and professional, but she was about to attempt something beyond her experience level, with nearly 200 lives hanging in the balance. I can talk you through it, Abigail offered. I've landed in much worse conditions. In a fighter jet, Walsh pointed out. This is different. The approach speeds, the handling characteristics, the margin for error, everything is different. Abigail nodded, acknowledging the valid concern. You're right. But the fundamental physics are identical. Wind is wind, regardless of the aircraft. Crosswind corrections follow the same principles whether you're landing on a carrier deck or a commercial runway. Kansas City approach interrupted their conversation. United 847, we need your intentions. Weather is continuing to deteriorate, and we may need to divert you to St. Louis if you can't accept the approach to Kansas City. Walsh looked at her fuel gauges. They had enough for one approach attempt at Kansas City, maybe a missed approach and diversion to St. Louis, but not much margin for error. The mathematical precision required left no room for hesitation or uncertainty. What would you do? Walsh asked quietly, the question carrying the weight of command decision she wasn't sure she was qualified to make. Abigail studied the weather display, calculated wind vectors in her head, and considered the options with the cold logic that had made her an exceptional fighter pilot. The conditions are challenging but manageable. Kansas City is our best option. St. Louis will be just as bad by the time we get there, and we'll have less fuel for a second attempt. Can you? Walsh paused, clearly struggling with the question she needed to ask. Can you take the controls? It was the moment Abigail had been simultaneously dreading and preparing for since she'd stood up from row 12. Technically, she had no legal authority to assume control of a commercial aircraft. She wasn't current on Boeing 737 systems, hadn't flown any aircraft in 8 years, and was operating entirely outside the regulatory framework that governed commercial aviation. But 183 people were depending on someone to make an impossible decision work. I can guide you through it, Abigail said carefully. You maintain legal authority as the certified pilot in command, but I can provide tactical guidance based on my experience with challenging approaches. Walsh nodded, understanding the distinction. Okay, talk me through what you're seeing. Abigail moved closer to the instrument panel, her eyes scanning the displays with practiced efficiency. First, let's set up for a stabilized approach. Current winds are 290 at 35, gusting to 40. Runway 1 left is magnetic heading 010, so we've got about a 45-degree crosswind component. That's significant but manageable. As Abigail began walking Walsh through wind correction techniques she'd mastered on aircraft carriers, word was spreading through the cabin that a passenger with pilot experience was assisting in the cockpit. The reaction was mixed. Some passengers felt reassured that additional expertise was available, while others worried that the situation had become so desperate that the crew needed help from passengers. In row 23, retired Air Force Colonel James Peterson listened to the muffled conversations around him and wished he could contribute more than moral support. His military transport experience might have been useful, but the woman who'd gone forward clearly had credentials that exceeded his own. Dr. Patricia Reeves, still working on Captain Harrison in first class, monitored his condition while trying to ignore the increasingly tense radio communications bleeding through from the cockpit. Harrison was stable but critical. He needed immediate cardiac intervention that only a hospital could provide. Ladies and gentlemen, Walsh's voice came over the intercom, steadier now with Abigail's guidance. We're beginning our approach to Kansas City International Airport. The weather is challenging, so please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened and prepare for what may be a firm landing. As United Flight 847 descended through the storm toward Kansas City, passengers gripped armrests and said silent prayers, unaware that their fate now rested on an unprecedented partnership, a young first officer flying beyond her experience level, guided by a former Top Gun pilot who was about to attempt something she'd sworn she'd never do again, trust her life, and the lives of others, to her ability to fly through conditions that had defeated lesser pilots. The woman who'd spent 8 years hiding from aviation was about to discover whether her skills had survived the years of deliberate neglect, and whether the confidence that had once made her exceptional could be rekindled when it mattered most. The Boeing 737 shuddered through another pocket of turbulence as it descended through 15,000 feet toward Kansas City International. Inside, The cockpit. First Officer Jennifer Walsh gripped the controls with white knuckles while Abigail Fowler stood behind her, eyes locked on the instrument panel with the focused intensity of a surgeon preparing for a critical operation. "Airspeed is looking good at 180 knots, Abigail said, her voice carrying the calm authority that had once made her the Navy's youngest fighter weapons instructor. "But watch your vertical speed indicator, you're descending a bit fast for these wind conditions." Walsh made the correction smoothly, pulling back slightly on the yoke. Despite her nervousness, she was responding well to Abigail's guidance, her commercial training providing a solid foundation that military precision could build upon. "Kansas City approach, United 847, Walsh transmitted. "We're with you descending through 15,000 for the ILS approach to runway 1 left. United 847, Kansas City approach. Radar contact. Turn left heading 350, descend and maintain 8,000. Winds now 280 at 38, gusting to 44. Emergency equipment remains in position." The wind report made both women pause. Gusting to 44 knots was beyond the recommended crosswind limits for a Boeing 737, placing them in a gray area where regulations suggested extreme caution but didn't explicitly prohibit the approach. "That's getting into dangerous territory," Walsh murmured, glancing at Abigail with obvious concern. "I've landed in worse," Abigail replied, though privately she acknowledged that her previous experience had been in aircraft specifically designed for challenging conditions. The F/A-18 Super Hornet was built to land on carrier decks in rolling seas with 30-knot crosswinds. A commercial airliner had different tolerances, different handling characteristics, and far less margin for aggressive corrections. But Captain Harrison's condition wasn't improving. Their fuel was burning steadily toward critical levels, and St. Louis was reporting similar weather conditions. They were committed to Kansas City, whether the wind cooperated or not. "Okay," Abigail said, moving closer to Walsh's shoulder. "Here's what we're going to do. The crosswind is from the left, so we'll need to establish a crab angle during the approach to track the runway centerline. Then, just before touchdown, we'll kick out the crab and use aileron input to keep the aircraft aligned." Walsh nodded, though Abigail could see the tension building in her shoulders. The technique Abigail was describing called a crab and kick. Landing was standard procedure for crosswind approaches, but it required precise timing and confidence that comes only from experience. "I've done it in the simulator," Walsh said, "but never in conditions this severe." "The simulator is actually harder in some ways," Abigail replied, remembering her own training days. "Real aircraft give you better feedback through the controls. You'll feel what the wind is doing and be able to respond naturally." As they continued their descent, flight attendant Sarah Martinez appeared in the cockpit doorway. "How's it looking up here?" "Challenging but manageable," Abigail answered before Walsh could respond. "How's Captain Harrison?" "Dr. Reeves says he's stable but critical. She's concerned about the stress of a rough landing on his condition." The additional pressure settled on Walsh's shoulders like a physical weight. Not only did she need to safely land 183 passengers, but she had to do it smoothly enough to avoid further compromising their captain's precarious health. "We'll get him down safely," Abigail said with conviction she didn't entirely feel. "Tell Dr. Reeves to prepare for landing in about 12 minutes. At 8,000 feet, Kansas City International Airport became visible through the storm, a collection of lights struggling to penetrate the snow and wind. The runway appeared as a thin line of brightness in an otherwise hostile environment, looking impossibly narrow from their current altitude. "Kansas City approach, United 847, is established on the localizer, requesting clearance for the ILS approach to runway 1 left. United 847, you are cleared for the ILS approach runway 1 left. Contact tower on 118.4. Good luck." The controller's final comment wasn't standard phraseology, but it reflected the reality that everyone on the ground understood. What was about to happen would test the limits of both aircraft and crew. Walsh switched to tower frequency. Kansas City Tower, United 847, is on the ILS approach to runway 1 left. United 847, Kansas City Tower. Wind 280 at 40, gusting to 46. Runway 1 left cleared to land. Emergency equipment is standing by. The wind had increased again. Abigail felt her jaw tighten as she processed the implications. They were now dealing with crosswinds that exceeded the aircraft's certified limits, placing them in a situation where even experienced captains might consider a missed approach. "Jennifer, I need you to trust me completely for the next 10 minutes, Abigail said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded million-dollar aircraft in life-or-death situations. "I'm going to talk you through every input, every correction. Don't second-guess, just respond." Walsh nodded, her grip on the controls relaxing slightly as she prepared to follow Abigail's guidance with absolute precision. "First, establish your crab angle. We need about 15 degrees left to compensate for the crosswind component. Turn the aircraft slightly left until the runway centerline appears stable on your windscreen." Walsh made the adjustment, and immediately, the aircraft's nose pointed well left of the runway while their ground track remained aligned with the centerline. To passengers looking out the windows, it would appear they were flying sideways toward the airport, a disconcerting but necessary illusion. "Perfect. Now maintain that crab angle until we're about 50 feet above the runway. The key is patience. Don't try to align the aircraft with the runway too early." At 3,000 feet above ground, the turbulence intensified dramatically. The Boeing 737 bucked and rolled as it encountered wind shear from the storm system, forcing Walsh to make constant corrections to maintain their approach path. "This is rough," Walsh said through gritted teeth, fighting to keep the aircraft stable. "You're doing great," Abigail encouraged, watching the instruments carefully. "Remember, the aircraft wants to fly. Don't fight it, work with it. Small inputs, constant corrections." In the cabin behind them, passengers were experiencing the full intensity of the approach. The aircraft rolled left and right as Walsh fought the crosswinds, and the constant turbulence made normal conversation impossible. Flight attendants had taken their seats and were holding on tightly, trusting that whatever was happening in the cockpit would get them safely to the ground. Dr. Patricia Reeves, still monitoring Captain Harrison in first class, watched his vital signs spike with each violent movement of the aircraft. His heart rhythm, already compromised by the cardiac event, was becoming increasingly irregular under the stress of the turbulent approach. "We need to get on the ground soon," she told Martinez through her headset. "His condition is deteriorating." At 1,000 feet above ground, Kansas City International's runway 1 left stretched before them like a beacon in the storm. The runway lights were clearly visible now, but so was the severity of the crosswind. Snow was blowing horizontally across the pavement, and they could see emergency vehicles positioned along the runway edges, their red and blue lights flashing, in preparation for what everyone hoped would be an unnecessary response. "Okay, Jennifer, this is where it gets technical," Abigail said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "At 100 feet, I'm going to tell you to kick out the crab. You'll need to apply right rudder to align the nose with the runway centerline, while simultaneously using left aileron to prevent the aircraft from drifting right." "Rudder and opposite aileron," Walsh repeated, her voice tense but focused. "Exactly. The timing is critical. Too early and we'll drift off centerline. Too late and we'll touch down sideways." At 500 feet, a massive gust of wind caught the aircraft and rolled it 30 degrees to the left. Walsh instinctively overcorrected, rolling back to the right before Abigail's calm voice brought her back to center. "Easy, that was just a gust. We're still on approach path. Trust your instruments. 300 feet. The runway was rushing toward them now, and passengers could see the ground approaching through their windows. Some closed their eyes and prayed. Others watched in fascination as their pilots attempted something that looked impossible from their perspective. 200 feet. Walsh's breathing was rapid and shallow, her hands moving constantly on the controls as she fought to keep the aircraft aligned with the runway. "You're doing perfectly," Abigail said. 100 feet coming up. Get ready for the kick out. 100 feet. Now, right rudder, left aileron. Walsh executed the maneuver with precision that surprised even Abigail. The aircraft's nose swung right to align with the runway while the left aileron prevented drift, creating the momentary illusion that they were sliding sideways through the air just above the pavement. 50 feet. The runway filled their windscreen, and Abigail could see individual lights along the center line. Hold it steady. Hold it. 20 feet. The main landing gear was seconds from touchdown when another massive gust hit the aircraft, threatening to push them off the runway center line. Left aileron. More rudder. Abigail commanded, and Walsh responded instantly. The Boeing 737's main landing gear touched down on Kansas City's runway 1 left with a firm but controlled impact. For a split second, the aircraft bounced slightly as the crosswind tried to push them sideways, but Walsh's continued inputs kept them tracking straight down the center line. "Thrust reversers, maximum braking," Abigail called out, and Walsh deployed the Boeing stopping systems with textbook precision. The aircraft rolled out safely, coming to a stop 4,000 feet down the 10,000-foot runway. For a moment, the cockpit was silent except for the sound of wind still buffeting the aircraft and the steady whine of engines spooling down. Then Walsh keyed the radio with hands that were finally beginning to shake from released adrenaline. "Kansas City Tower, United 847, is safely on the ground. United 847, welcome to Kansas City. Taxi via Alpha to the gate. Emergency equipment will escort you." As the aircraft turned off the runway, applause erupted in the cabin, a sound of relief, gratitude, and recognition that they'd just experienced something extraordinary. Passengers who'd been terrified minutes earlier were now laughing and crying simultaneously, the emotional release of survival overwhelming their normal reserve. In the cockpit, Walsh turned to Abigail with eyes that reflected amazement and exhaustion. In equal measure, "I can't believe we just did that." "You did that," Abigail corrected. "I just provided guidance. That landing was all your skill." But privately, Abigail felt something she hadn't experienced in 8 years: the satisfaction of flying through impossible conditions and bringing everyone home safely. For a brief moment, she remembered why she'd loved aviation before loss had driven her away from it. As emergency medical personnel boarded the aircraft to attend to Captain Harrison, and as passengers began the process of continuing their interrupted journeys, nobody yet realized that the quiet woman from row 12, Seat C, had just performed one of the most remarkable feats of airmanship in commercial aviation history, and that her story was only beginning to unfold. The gate at Kansas City International Airport buzzed with controlled chaos as emergency vehicles surrounded United Flight 847. Paramedics rushed aboard to attend to Captain Harrison while ground crews performed post-flight inspections, checking for any structural damage from the violent crosswind landing. Inside the aircraft, passengers remained seated, many still processing what they'd just experienced. Abigail stood in the cockpit doorway, watching the organized emergency response with professional appreciation. The ground crews moved with practiced efficiency, their actions coordinated by controllers who understood that time was critical for Captain Harrison's survival. Within minutes, medical personnel had Harrison on a stretcher and were rushing him toward a waiting ambulance. "Ma'am?" A voice behind her interrupted her observations. Abigail turned to find a man in his 50s wearing a Kansas City International Airport Authority badge. I'm Terminal Manager Robert Chuno, relation I assume, and I need to speak with you about what just happened up there. First Officer Jennifer Walsh, who was completing her post-flight checklist with hands that still trembled slightly from adrenaline, looked up with concern. Is there a problem? No problem, Chun assured them both. But the FAA is going to want a detailed report about the emergency assistance provided by a passenger. This is unprecedented in commercial aviation. Abigail felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. For 8 years, she'd successfully avoided any situation that might draw official attention to her aviation background. Now she was about to face the full scrutiny of federal investigators, airline executives, and potentially the media. I just provided guidance, Abigail said carefully. First Officer Walsh performed all the actual flying and decision-making. Chun consulted his tablet, reading from what appeared to be preliminary reports. According to air traffic control recordings, you identified yourself as a Top Gun graduate with over 2,000 hours of military flight experience. That's going to generate significant interest from multiple agencies. As they spoke, passengers were beginning to deplane, many stopping to thank both Walsh and Abigail personally. An elderly woman from row 8 clasped Abigail's hands with tears in her eyes. My granddaughter is getting married this weekend in Boston, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. Because of what you did, I'll be there to walk her down the aisle. How do I thank someone for that? Similar scenes played out repeatedly as passengers filed past. A businessman mentioned his daughter's birthday party that evening. A college student talked about final exams she couldn't afford to miss. Each interaction drove home the reality that Abigail's decision to step forward had affected far more than just flight operations. It had preserved nearly 200 individual futures. Jennifer Walsh finished her checklist and joined the conversation with Terminal Manager Chun. I need to make something clear in any official report, she said, her voice carrying new confidence born from successfully completing an impossible landing. Without Ms. Fowler's guidance, I'm not certain I could have safely completed that approach. She didn't take control of the aircraft, but her technical expertise was essential to our success. Chun nodded, making notes on his tablet. The preliminary investigation will need to address several questions. First, the regulatory implications of a non-current, non-type-rated pilot providing guidance during an emergency. Second, the decision-making process that led to attempting a landing in crosswinds that exceeded recommended limits. And third, the crew resource management aspects of incorporating passenger expertise into flight operations. Is she in trouble? Walsh asked, genuine concern evident in her voice. Unlikely, Chun replied. Emergency situations provide significant latitude for crew decisions, and the successful outcome will weigh heavily in any evaluation, but there will be questions. As if summoned by Chun's mention of investigations, a woman in a crisp business suit approached their group. Ms. Fowler? I'm Rebecca Martinez from United Airlines Flight Operations. Could I speak with you privately? Abigail followed Martinez to a quiet corner of the gate area, her mind racing through potential complications. Airlines were notoriously conservative about anything that deviated from standard procedures, even when those deviations resulted in positive outcomes. First, let me say that United Airlines is grateful for your assistance today, Martinez began. Captain Harrison is stable and receiving excellent care at University of Kansas Medical Center. Preliminary reports suggest he'll make a full recovery. I'm glad to hear that, Abigail replied, though she sensed Martinez had more to say. However, we need to discuss the broader implications of what happened. Your involvement has already generated significant media attention. There are reporters at the terminal asking questions about the mystery pilot who helped land the aircraft. As if to emphasize her point, Martinez gestured toward the terminal windows, where Abigail could see news vans with satellite dishes beginning to gather in the parking area. "I never intended for this to become public," Abigail said, feeling her carefully constructed private life beginning to crumble. "I understand, but in today's connected world, passenger cell phone videos and social media posts have already begun circulating. Someone recorded the approach from inside the cabin, and the audio of your conversation with First Officer Walsh has been captured on multiple devices." Martinez showed Abigail her phone, displaying a Twitter post that was already going viral. "Hero passenger lands plane in storm. Former Navy pilot saves 183 lives when captain has heart attack. Hashtag miracle at KCI. Hashtag Top Gun to the rescue." The post had already been shared over 3,000 times in the 30 minutes since they'd landed. "This is going to change your life," Martinez said gently. "United would like to work with you to manage the media response, but ultimately, you'll need to decide how much of your story you want to share publicly." Abigail stared at the phone screen, watching the retweet counter climb steadily. For 8 years, she'd been successfully invisible, living a quiet life as a consultant while her military achievements gathered dust in storage boxes. Now, in the span of one emergency landing, she was becoming an internet sensation. "What kind of media response are we talking about?" she asked. "National news interviews, morning shows, probably international coverage given the dramatic nature of the story. The combination of a female Top Gun pilot and a passenger-assisted emergency landing is exactly the kind of human interest story that captures global attention." Before Abigail could respond, her phone began ringing. The caller ID showed her brother David's number, but she knew the call was probably prompted by news alerts rather than coincidence. "Abby, are you okay? I'm seeing news reports about a United Airlines emergency landing, and someone posted that you were involved." "I'm fine, David. I'll call you back later." "Wait, is it true? Did you really help land a commercial aircraft? The reports are saying you're some kind of military pilot, but I thought you worked in logistics." The conversation was a preview of dozens of similar calls she could expect from family, friends, and former colleagues once the story gained wider circulation. Her 8-year effort to separate her civilian identity from her military background was about to be completely shattered. Martinez, who had discreetly moved away during the personal call, returned with additional information. "The FAA wants to conduct a preliminary interview this afternoon if you're available. It's standard procedure for any unusual flight operations, and your cooperation would be appreciated." "Am I required to participate?" "No, but your input could be valuable for improving emergency procedures in the future. What you and First Officer Walsh accomplished today could become a case study for how commercial aviation handles similar situations." As Abigail considered her options, she noticed a small crowd gathering near the gate windows. Passengers from other flights were pointing and taking pictures, clearly recognizing her from the rapidly spreading social media coverage. "There's something else," Martinez added, consulting her own phone. "We've been contacted by several major airlines, asking about your current aviation credentials and availability for consulting positions. Apparently, your performance today has generated significant industry interest." The irony wasn't lost on Abigail. For 8 years, she deliberately avoided aviation-related opportunities, building a successful but unfulfilling career in corporate consulting. Now, a single emergency situation was generating more professional aviation opportunities than she'd ever imagined possible. "I need some time to process all this," Abigail said, feeling overwhelmed by the rapid pace of developments. "Of course. Here's my direct number." Martinez handed her a business card. "United would like to discuss several opportunities with you once you've had time to adjust to the situation. But for now, I'd recommend avoiding the main terminal exits. There are reporters positioned at most of them." As Martinez walked away, Abigail found herself alone for the first time since stepping forward in row 12. She sat down in an empty gate area and looked out at the storm that was finally beginning to clear over Kansas City. The wind that had made their landing so treacherous was calming, and patches of blue sky were visible between the departing clouds. Her phone buzzed with another notification. This time it was a LinkedIn message from Admiral Sarah Mitchell, her former commanding officer. At Top Gun, Abigail, I just saw the news reports. Magnificent work today. We should talk. There are opportunities you need to know about. The Navy hasn't forgotten what you're capable of. Abigail stared at the message, realizing that her carefully controlled life had just taken a dramatic turn she hadn't anticipated. The woman who'd spent 8 years hiding from aviation was about to become its most visible advocate, whether she wanted to or not. The question now wasn't whether her life would change, but how she would choose to shape that change. The hotel room at the Kansas City Airport Marriott felt like a sanctuary compared to the chaos that had erupted in the terminal. Abigail sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her laptop screen as CNN played footage of United Flight 847's dramatic landing, captured by a passenger's phone from inside the cabin. The video showed the aircraft bucking through turbulence, the violent crosswind correction just before touchdown, and the moment of successful contact with the runway, followed by spontaneous applause. This is Anderson Cooper 360. We begin tonight with an extraordinary story of heroism at 35,000 feet. Abigail muted the television and opened her phone to find 47 missed calls, 312 text messages, and over 800 LinkedIn connection requests. Her carefully maintained professional network had exploded overnight as word spread through the aviation industry that the consultant, Abigail Fowler, was actually former Lieutenant Commander Abigail Chun, one of the Navy's most decorated female fighter pilots. The first call she returned was to her parents in Potomac. Her mother answered on the first ring, her voice carrying a mixture of pride, concern, and confusion that Abigail remembered from her Top Gun graduation 12 years earlier. Abigail, we've been watching the news all evening. Your father is here, and we need to understand what happened. The reporters are saying you saved nearly 200 people, but we thought you worked in logistics consulting. I do work in consulting, Mom, but I used to be a naval aviator. I never told you the full extent of my military service. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before her father's voice joined the conversation on speaker. You were a fighter pilot? All these years, we thought you were in supply management or something administrative. I know what you thought, and I let you think that because it was easier than explaining why I left aviation. But yes, I was a fighter pilot, TOPGU, and graduate actually. Her mother's voice softened with understanding. This has something to do with Michael, doesn't it? Your husband's death? Abigail closed her eyes, feeling the familiar ache that accompanied any discussion of Michael. I couldn't fly anymore after he died. Every time I got in a cockpit, I saw his aircraft going down. So I left the Navy and built a different life. But today you flew again, her father observed. What changed? I didn't actually fly the aircraft, Dad. I just provided guidance to the first officer. But yes, I used skills I'd been trying to forget for 8 years. And it felt... She paused, searching for words to describe the complex emotions of the day. It felt like I remembered who I used to be. After ending the call with her parents, Abigail faced the stack of business cards and contact information that had accumulated throughout the afternoon. Rebecca Martinez from United Airlines had been joined by representatives from Delta, American, Southwest, and 3 major aviation consulting firms. Each was interested in discussing career opportunities that would leverage her unique combination of military expertise and demonstrated crisis management capabilities. The most intriguing contact came from an unexpected source, Dr. Amanda Phillips, from the Federal Aviation Administration's Office of Accident Investigation. Phillips had left a voicemail requesting a meeting to discuss not just the day's events, but broader implications for commercial aviation emergency procedures, Ms. Fowler. What you accomplished today reveals a significant gap in our current emergency response protocols. We'd like to explore how passenger expertise might be better utilized during crisis situations, and whether current regulations adequately address scenarios like the one you encountered. Abigail returned the call and found herself in a conversation that stretched far beyond simple incident reporting. Dr. Phillips, I want to emphasize that First Officer Walsh performed exceptionally under extreme pressure. My contribution was purely advisory. Understood, but your advisory input was based on expertise that isn't typically available during commercial flights. We're interested in developing protocols that could identify and utilize passenger expertise more systematically during emergencies. Are you suggesting some kind of passenger pilot registry? Possibly. We're also considering enhanced crew resource management training that would help flight crews better assess and incorporate external expertise when appropriate. Your situation today was handled well through improvisation, but we'd like to develop formal procedures for similar scenarios. The conversation revealed that Abigail's emergency assistance had triggered broader discussions within the FAA about modernizing emergency response procedures. Her case was being studied not just as an isolated incident, but as a potential model for improving aviation safety through better resource utilization. That evening, as Abigail prepared for what she knew would be a challenging media interview, the following morning, her phone rang with a call that changed everything. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the voice was unmistakably familiar. Commander Chun? This is Admiral Sarah Mitchell. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I felt we needed to speak directly. Admiral, it's good to hear from you. And it's just Abigail now. I've been out of the Navy for 8 years. I'm aware of your civilian status, but your performance today suggests that your military instincts remain sharp. I'm calling because the Navy has been following developments with considerable interest. Admiral Mitchell's tone carried the authority that Abigail remembered from her Top Gun days, but also something new, a note of opportunity that made her pulse quicken. The naval aviation community has been discussing a new initiative, Mitchell continued. We're developing an advanced civilian-military pilot exchange program designed to enhance emergency response capabilities in both sectors. Today's events have accelerated interest in this program considerably. What kind of exchange program? Experienced military pilots would work with commercial airlines on emergency procedures and crisis management, while commercial pilots would train with military units on advanced techniques and decision-making under pressure. You'd be perfect to lead the civilian coordination side. The offer was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. Abigail had spent 8 years building a life that had nothing to do with aviation, and now she was being offered opportunities to return to the field at the highest levels. Admiral, I appreciate the confidence, but I'm not sure I'm ready to fully re-engage with aviation. Today it was one emergency situation, not a career change. I understand your hesitation, but consider this. Your actions today proved that your skills haven't diminished. More importantly, they demonstrated something we desperately need in aviation: the ability to remain calm and effective when everything goes wrong. After the call ended, Abigail found herself facing a decision she'd never anticipated having to make. Her laptop displayed email after email from aviation industry leaders, military officials, and media representatives, all wanting to discuss her future in a field she deliberately abandoned. The woman who'd boarded Flight 847 that morning as a logistics consultant was being offered opportunities to reshape commercial aviation safety protocols, lead military-civilian cooperation initiatives, and become a public advocate for enhanced emergency preparedness. But accepting these opportunities would mean abandoning the quiet Life she'd carefully constructed, and returning to a world that carried painful memories of loss and sacrifice. Phone buzzed with a text message from First Officer Jennifer Walsh. "Abigail, I know today has been overwhelming for you, but I wanted you to know that United Airlines has offered me a promotion to captain, based partly on my performance during the emergency. I couldn't have done it without your guidance. Whatever you decide about your future, know that you've already changed mine for the better." The message reminded Abigail that her actions that day had created ripple effects beyond her own life. Walsh's career trajectory had been permanently altered by their successful partnership. Captain Harrison was alive because of their quick thinking, and 183 passengers had returned safely to their families. As she prepared for bed in the Kansas City hotel room, Abigail realized that the choice facing her wasn't simply about returning to aviation. It was about whether she was ready to step fully into a role as a leader and advocate in a field that desperately needed her expertise. Outside her window, aircraft continued their normal operations at Kansas City International, their lights tracing familiar patterns across the night sky. For the first time in 8 years, watching those lights didn't trigger painful memories of Michael's death. Instead, they reminded her of the satisfaction she'd felt that afternoon when Flight 847 touched down safely. Despite impossible conditions, the woman who'd spent nearly a decade hiding from her past was about to discover whether she had the courage to embrace a future that demanded everything she'd once been, and more than she'd ever imagined she could become. The NBC studio in Chicago felt surreal after 8 years of corporate conference rooms and logistics presentations. Abigail sat across from Savannah Guthrie on the Today Show set, surrounded by professional lighting and cameras that would broadcast her face to millions of viewers who'd been following the story of Flight 847's dramatic landing. With us now is Abigail Fowler, the former Navy Top Gun pilot who helped guide United Flight 847 to safety during yesterday's emergency. Abigail, thank you for joining us. Thank you for having me, Savannah. Let's start with the moment you realized you needed to step forward. What was going through your mind when you heard about the captain's medical emergency? Abigail had spent the previous evening with United Airlines media consultant preparing for this moment, but sitting under the studio lights, she found herself abandoning the prepared talking points in favor of raw honesty. "I was terrified," she said, her voice steady despite the admission. "For 8 years, I'd successfully avoided anything related to aviation. I'd built a completely different life as a consultant, and I was comfortable being invisible. But when I heard the stress in First Officer Walsh's voice, I realized that my fear of flying again was less important than the lives of 183 people. You've kept your military background secret for nearly a decade. Why?" The question touched the core of Abigail's transformation. "I lost my husband in a training accident when we were both naval aviators. After that, I couldn't separate flying from grief. Every time I got near an aircraft, I saw his crash happening again. So I resigned and built a life that had nothing to do with aviation. But yesterday, you were able to overcome that trauma and use your skills when they were desperately needed. Yesterday, I learned that sometimes our skills are bigger than our personal pain. When people need help, we have to find a way to rise above our own fears and limitations." The interview continued for another 10 minutes, covering technical aspects of the emergency landing and her future plans. But it was her comment about skills being bigger than personal pain that would be replayed across social media and news programs throughout the day. After the taping, Abigail's phone immediately buzzed with messages from aviation industry leaders who'd watched the live broadcast. The most significant came from Captain Sarah Williams, the first female pilot to command a major airline's flight operations center. "Abigail, I just watched your interview. Delta Airlines would like to offer you a position as Director of Emergency Response Training. We need someone with your combination of technical expertise and crisis leadership experience. The offer represented exactly the kind of high-level aviation position Abigail had once dreamed of during her military career. More importantly, it would allow her to develop training programs that could prevent other families from experiencing the trauma she'd endured. But before she could fully process Delta's offer, her phone rang with a call from Admiral Mitchell. "Outstanding interview, Commander. You handled the media attention with the same professionalism you showed in the cockpit. Thank you, Admiral. Though I have to admit, television interviews are more nerve-wracking than crosswind landings. I'm calling because the Secretary of the Navy watched your interview this morning. The civilian-military pilot exchange program I mentioned. He wants to fast-track it with you as the lead coordinator. We're talking about a position that would influence aviation safety across both military and commercial sectors." The magnitude of the opportunity struck Abigail immediately. She would be helping design training programs that could save thousands of lives while bridging the gap between military precision and commercial aviation efficiency. "What would the timeline look like?" she asked. "We could have you in position within 6 months. The program would be based at the Naval War College in Newport, but you'd travel extensively, working with airlines, military commands, and international aviation authorities." As Admiral Mitchell described the scope of the position, Abigail realized she was being offered a chance to transform her personal tragedy into systemic change that could benefit the entire aviation community. That afternoon, she found herself back at Kansas City International Airport, not as a passenger, but as a guest of United Airlines Flight Operations Center. Chief Pilot Richard Thompson had invited her to observe normal operations and discuss her insights into emergency procedures. "What strikes me most about yesterday's situation," Thompson said as they watched aircraft operations from the control center, "is how well you and First Officer Walsh work together despite never having flown as a team before. That kind of instant coordination is exactly what we need to develop in our emergency training." Military aviation emphasizes adaptability and resource utilization, Abigail replied, watching the Boeing 777 execute a perfect landing on the same runway where she'd guided Flight 847 down 24 hours earlier. "We're trained to incorporate any available expertise into mission planning, regardless of rank or typical responsibilities. That's something commercial aviation could learn from. We tend to operate within rigid hierarchies that sometimes prevent us from utilizing all available resources during emergencies." Their conversation was interrupted by Thompson's assistant, who handed him a tablet displaying real-time social media analytics. "Sir, you should see this. The hashtag Abigail Fowler has been trending worldwide for the past 6 hours. The video of yesterday's landing has been viewed over 50 million times." Abigail stared at the numbers, realizing that her story had transcended aviation circles and become a broader symbol of courage and competence under pressure. Comments from around the world praised not just her technical skills, but her decision to step forward when others might have remained silent. One comment particularly resonated with her. "My daughter is studying engineering and says she wants to be a pilot because of Abigail Fowler's story. Thank you for showing that heroes can be anyone." That evening, Abigail drove to University of Kansas Medical Center to visit Captain Robert Harrison, who was recovering well from his cardiac procedure. She found him in his hospital room, surrounded by flowers and cards from Flight 847 passengers who'd tracked down his location to express their gratitude. "Ms. Fowler," Harrison said, his voice stronger than she'd expected, "I understand I owe you my life, along with everyone else on that aircraft. You don't owe me anything, Captain. I just did what anyone with my training would have done." "That's where you're wrong," Harrison replied with a smile. "Most people with your training wouldn't have been working as logistics consultants for the past 8 years. You made a choice to help when you could have stayed anonymous in row 12. Their conversation revealed that Harrison himself was a former military pilot who'd transitioned to commercial aviation after leaving the Air Force. He understood the challenges of adapting military skills to civilian operations, and he'd been following news coverage of the various job offers Abigail was receiving. "Can I give you some advice?" he asked. "Don't let yesterday become just a one-time heroic story. The aviation industry needs people like you who can think beyond standard procedures when lives are at stake." As Abigail left the hospital, she reflected on the rapid transformation her life had undergone in less than 48 hours. The woman who'd boarded Flight 847 as an invisible consultant was now fielding job offers from major airlines, government agencies, and military commands. More significantly, she was beginning to understand that her 8-year retreat from aviation hadn't been healing, it had been hiding. Yesterday's emergency had forced her to confront skills and instincts she'd tried to suppress, and the experience had reminded her why she'd fallen in love with flying in the first place. That night, alone in her hotel room overlooking Kansas City International Airport, Abigail made the decision that would define the rest of her career. She opened her laptop and began typing acceptance letters, not to just one position, but to a comprehensive plan that would allow her to contribute to multiple aspects of aviation safety. She would accept Admiral Mitchell's offer to lead the civilian military pilot exchange program, while also consulting with Delta Airlines on emergency response training. More importantly, she would use her newfound public platform to advocate for systemic changes in how the aviation industry identifies and utilizes expertise during crisis situations. For the first time since Michael's death 8 years earlier, Abigail Fowler was ready to fly again, not just as a pilot, but as a leader who could help others navigate the impossible when everything went wrong. The woman who'd spent nearly a decade hiding from her past was about to become the future of aviation safety. One emergency at a time. 18 months after Flight 847's emergency landing, Captain Abigail Fowler stood before an audience of 500 aviation professionals at the International Aviation Safety Conference in Montreal. The woman who'd once hidden from anything related to flying now commanded attention as the director of the Joint Military-Civilian Aviation Safety Initiative, a program that had revolutionized emergency response training across both sectors. "When I boarded that United flight in Denver," she began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd found her true purpose, "I was running from aviation. Today, I'm here to discuss how that emergency taught us something crucial. Expertise exists everywhere, but only if we're willing to recognize and utilize it." The presentation she was about to deliver would outline the most significant changes in commercial aviation safety protocols in decades. Changes that had emerged directly from lessons learned during those terrifying minutes over Kansas City. Behind her, a massive screen displayed statistics that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. Since the implementation of the Fowler Protocol's emergency procedures, named in her honor passenger-assisted emergency landings, had increased by 340% worldwide. More importantly, survival rates during aviation emergencies had improved by 23%, representing thousands of lives saved through better resource utilization. The traditional model of aviation emergency response assumed that only certified crew members could contribute meaningfully to crisis resolution. Abigail continued, "Flight 847 proved that assumption was not just wrong, it was dangerous." In the audience, First Officer Jennifer Walsh, now Captain Walsh and Abigail's frequent speaking partner, smiled with pride. Their partnership had evolved far beyond that single emergency landing into a professional collaboration that was transforming how airlines trained their crews. The Fowler protocols had established systematic procedures for identifying passenger expertise during emergencies. Flight attendants now received training on recognizing aviation qualifications among passengers, while captains learned techniques for rapidly assessing and incorporating external expertise into emergency decision-making. The key breakthrough, Abigail explained to the Montreal audience, was understanding that emergency situations require us to abandon rigid hierarchies in favor of collaborative expertise. Military aviation has always operated this way. We use every available resource to complete the mission safely. Major airlines had implemented the protocols with remarkable success. Delta Airlines reported that passenger expertise had been successfully utilized in 12 emergency situations over the past year, ranging from medical emergencies involving doctor passengers to mechanical issues where engineer passengers provided critical insights. But the impact extended far beyond emergency procedures. Abigail's story had inspired a generation of women to pursue aviation careers. Enrollment in pilot training programs among women had increased by 67% since Flight 847, with many applicants specifically citing Abigail's example as their motivation. At the Naval Air Station Pensacola, where Abigail now served as a visiting instructor, a new program called Flight 847 Leadership Training taught young pilots how to remain calm under extreme pressure while effectively utilizing all available resources. Commander Fowler's approach to that emergency has become our model for crisis leadership, said Captain Maria Rodriguez, the station's training director. She demonstrated that true expertise isn't about following procedures. It's about adapting those procedures to unexpected circumstances. The program had attracted international attention. Aviation authorities from 17 countries had sent representatives to study the Fowler protocols, leading to their adoption by airlines and military organizations worldwide. Perhaps most significantly, Abigail's work had led to the development of the Global Aviation Resource Network, a database that allowed airlines to identify passengers with relevant expertise during emergencies. Pilots, doctors, engineers, and other professionals could voluntarily register their qualifications, making their skills available to flight crews when needed. We've created a system where a passenger's expertise becomes part of the aircraft's safety equipment, Abigail explained to the Montreal conference. Just like life vests and oxygen masks, human knowledge is a resource that can save lives, but only if we know how to deploy it effectively. The database had already been used successfully in dozens of situations. When a Lufthansa flight encountered hydraulic problems over the Atlantic, a Boeing engineer in seat 23C provided crucial insights that enabled a safe landing. During a medical emergency on a Singapore Airlines flight, 3 doctors and 2 nurses among the passengers formed an impromptu medical team that saved a passenger's life. But for Abigail, the most meaningful impact wasn't measured in statistics or protocol changes. It was found in personal stories like the one she received from 15-year-old Emma Harrison, Captain Robert Harrison's daughter. Ms. Fowler, Emma had written, "Because you saved my dad's life, he was able to walk me down the aisle at my high school graduation when I received the Top Aviation Student Award. I'm going to the Naval Academy next year because I want to be a pilot like you. Thank you for showing me that heroes come in all forms." The letter, framed on Abigail's office wall, reminded her daily that her decision to step forward in row 12 had created ripple effects that would continue for generations. During the Montreal conference's closing ceremony, Abigail was presented with the International Aviation Safety Foundation's highest honor, the Lindbergh Award for Outstanding Contribution to Aviation Safety. As she accepted the Crystal Trophy, she thought about the journey that had brought her from a grief-stricken widow hiding from aviation to a leader reshaping the industry's approach to emergency response. "This award doesn't belong to me alone," she said in her acceptance speech. "It belongs to every person who's ever stepped forward when others stepped back. It belongs to Jennifer Walsh, who trusted a stranger to help her fly through impossible conditions. It belongs to Captain Harrison, who reminded me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's action in spite of fear. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 5 minutes, but Abigail's mind was already focused on the future. The Joint Military-Civilian Aviation Safety Initiative was expanding to include spaceflight operations, where the collaboration between military precision and civilian innovation would be even more critical. NASA had approached her about developing emergency protocols for commercial spaceflights, recognizing that the principles she'd established for aviation emergencies would be essential as space tourism expanded. "The frontier is always changing," she'd told her team the previous week, "but the fundamental truth remains the same. In crisis situations, we need every available resource working together to bring people home safely." That evening, as the Montreal conference concluded, Abigail stood on her hotel balcony overlooking the St. Lawrence River. Commercial aircraft traced familiar patterns across the night sky, their lights following routes made safer by protocols that had emerged from one terrible and wonderful day over Kansas City. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Walsh. "Abby, just completed another successful passenger-assisted landing in Denver. A doctor helped us handle a medical emergency at 30,000 feet. The flight attendant said, 'Just like Captain Fowler taught us, you've changed everything.'" Abigail smiled, remembering her promise to Michael before his final flight that she would always find a way to bring people home safely. She'd kept that promise in ways she could never have imagined. The woman who'd once been invisible in row 12, seat C, had become the most visible advocate for aviation safety in the world. More importantly, she'd learned that running from tragedy only delays healing, while running toward purpose can transform pain into progress. Somewhere below her hotel window, another flight was departing Montreal for destinations around the world, carrying passengers who would never know that their journey was safer, because one woman had chosen courage over comfort during a storm over Kansas City. And in cockpits around the globe, pilots trained with protocols that ensured they would never have to face impossible situations alone, because expertise, Abigail had proven, was always available to those brave enough to ask for help and wise enough to listen when it was offered. The legacy of Flight 847 would continue long after the last person who remembered that snowy day had forgotten the details. It lived on in safer skies, better training, and the understanding that heroism isn't about being perfect. It's about being present when others need you most. Captain Abigail Fowler had finally come home to the sky, and she'd brought everyone with her. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.